King George III. He was the monarch of the world's most powerful empire, ruling Britain and its vast colonies with absolute authority. King George III was known for his dedication to duty, his love of farming, and his stable family life. For decades, he was the embodiment of royal composure. Then, in 1788, something inside the king shattered. During a dinner at Windsor Castle, he began speaking rapidly and incoherently, addressing people who weren't there. He grabbed the Prince of Wales by the collar and physically attacked him. His speech became an endless torrent of words, sometimes continuing for 19 hours without pause. Doctors restrained him in a straitjacket and subjected him to brutal treatments, including blistering his skin with caustic substances and forcing him into ice baths. They believed he was simply mad, but the king was likely suffering from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that causes severe neurological symptoms. The episodes came and went over the years, each time stripping away more of his dignity. During his final breakdown in 1810, the king retreated entirely from reality. He spent his last decade in isolation at Windsor Castle, blind and deaf, conversing with people he believed to be long dead. He would wear a purple dressing gown and speak to his deceased daughter for hours. The man who once ruled an empire died in 1820, having not recognized his own family for years. His illness changed the course of British history, leading to the Regency period and ultimately influencing how we understand the intersection of power and mental health. It proves that even the mightiest throne offers no protection from the collapse of the mind. Friedrich Nietzsche. In the winter streets of Turin, Italy, one of history's greatest minds was about to fracture completely. Friedrich Nietzsche was 44 years old, and at the height of his philosophical powers. His ideas about morality, religion, and human nature were revolutionary, challenging everything Western civilization held sacred. On January 3rd, 1889, Nietzsche witnessed a horse being brutally whipped by its owner. Something in this scene triggered a catastrophic collapse. He threw his arms around the horse's neck, sobbing uncontrollably, and then fell to the ground. He was carried back to his lodgings, where his behavior became increasingly bizarre. He would dance naked, sing wildly, and tear up his manuscripts. He sent letters to friends signing them as Dionysus, or the Crucified One, believing himself to be a god. Within days, his mother arrived to take him back to Germany. For the remaining 11 years of his life, Nietzsche existed in a state of near-total mental absence. The man who wrote God is Dead and prophesied the Übermensch could no longer dress himself or form coherent sentences. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, occasionally playing simple melodies on the piano. Medical records suggest he suffered from tertiary syphilis, which had slowly destroyed his brain tissue over years. Others have theorized it was a slow-growing brain tumor or an inherited psychiatric condition. What made his breakdown particularly tragic was the timing. His greatest works, including Thus Spoke Zarathustra, were just beginning to gain recognition when his mind disappeared. He died in 1900, never knowing the profound impact his ideas would have on the 20th century. The philosopher who explored the depths of human consciousness lost his own, leaving us to wonder if his insights came at the cost of his sanity. Virginia Woolf. She was one of the 20th century's most innovative writers, a pioneer of modernist literature whose stream of consciousness prose revolutionized the novel. Virginia Woolf's mind was a place of extraordinary beauty and terrifying darkness. Throughout her life, she experienced what she called the voices periods, when reality itself seemed to fracture. Her first major breakdown occurred in 1895 at age 13, following her mother's sudden death. She heard birds singing in Greek and King Edward VII cursing from behind the azalea bushes. These episodes would return throughout her life with increasing severity. In 1904, after her father's death, she attempted suicide by jumping from a window. She survived, but the pattern was established. Each breakdown followed a familiar trajectory. First came insomnia and violent headaches, then racing thoughts that made writing impossible. Finally, the complete dissolution of the boundary between her internal world and external reality. During episodes, she would become violent, refusing food, and shrieking for hours. Her husband, Leonard, became her constant guardian, monitoring her moods obsessively. The breakdowns intensified during the creation of her greatest works. While writing Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, she teetered on the edge of complete collapse. Writing was both her salvation and her torment. In March 1941, with World War II raging and another breakdown approaching, Virginia made her final decision. She filled her pockets with stones, walked into the River Ouse near her home in Sussex, and drowned herself. She was 59 years old. Her suicide note to Leonard was heartbreakingly lucid, explaining that she felt the voices returning and couldn't face another descent into madness. She wrote, "I feel certain I am going mad again. I cannot go through another of those terrible times." What's particularly devastating is that modern psychiatry now recognizes she likely suffered from bipolar disorder, a condition that is highly treatable with medication that didn't exist in her time. Her death wasn't inevitable. It was a failure of the era's understanding of mental illness. Howard Hughes. He was America's golden boy, a brilliant aviator, film producer, and industrial magnate who embodied the American dream. Howard Hughes set world aviation records, dated Hollywood starlets, and built an empire worth billions. He was handsome, charismatic, and seemingly invincible. But beneath the public persona, something was unraveling. Hughes had always been particular about cleanliness, a trait that seemed merely eccentric in his youth. By the 1950s, this quirk had metastasized into a consuming obsession. He began writing detailed memos to his staff about how to open cans without contamination, describing procedures that took several paragraphs. He would spend hours washing his hands until they bled. By 1966, Hughes had retreated entirely from public life. He checked into the Desert Inn penthouse in Las Vegas and refused to leave. When the hotel wanted him to vacate, he simply bought the entire property. For the next 4 years, he lived in a single room with blackout curtains. He sat naked in the center of the room on paper towels, surrounded by towers of tissue boxes he called his insulation. He stopped cutting his hair and nails, which grew to grotesque lengths. He would watch the same movies hundreds of times and ate only chicken and chocolate. His staff was forbidden from looking directly at him and had to use multiple layers of tissue paper when handling anything he would touch. He communicated only through handwritten notes, some running to hundreds of pages about minute details of daily operations. The man who once flew faster than anyone on Earth now couldn't leave a single room. In 1976, his staff found him dead on a private jet being transferred between hideouts. He weighed only 90 pounds, with needle marks covering his arms from codeine addiction. The autopsy revealed he had suffered from advanced syphilis, which may have contributed to his paranoia, but his primary diagnosis was severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. His fortune was worth over $2 billion, yet he died in squalor, having not spoken to another human being directly in over a decade. Hughes's breakdown shows that wealth and achievement offer no immunity from the prison of a diseased mind. Robert Schumann. He was one of the Romantic era's greatest composers, creating music of profound emotional depth and technical brilliance. Robert Schumann's compositions reflected both the heights of human joy and the depths of despair, because he lived in both extremes. Throughout his career, Schumann experienced wild mood swings. He would spend months in manic creative frenzies, composing masterpiece after masterpiece, barely sleeping. These would be followed by periods of paralytic depression where he couldn't write a single note. In 1833, he attempted suicide during a depressive episode but was stopped by his family. The pattern continued for 2 decades, with the episodes growing more severe. By 1854, the 43-year-old composer was experiencing terrifying auditory hallucinations. He heard musical notes that wouldn't stop, building into an unbearable cacophony. He told his wife Clara, herself a renowned pianist, that angels were dictating music to him. Then the angels' voices turned demonic. On February 27, 1854, Schumann walked out of his house in a thin dressing gown during a rainstorm. He wandered to the Rhine River and threw himself from a bridge into the freezing water. He was rescued by fishermen, but the man they pulled from the river was not the same composer. Schumann begged to be taken to an asylum. He was admitted to a private facility in Endenich, where he would spend the last 2 years of his life. His final period was marked by alternating lucidity and complete confusion. Sometimes he would recognize Clara during her visits, other times he would stare through her as if she were a stranger. He refused most food, gradually starving himself. Toward the end, he could no longer speak coherently. On July 29, 1856, Robert Schumann died, likely from pneumonia complicated by self-starvation. Medical historians now believe he suffered from what we would call bipolar disorder, with psychotic features. The same neurological patterns that created his musical genius ultimately destroyed him. His breakdown and death devastated the musical world and left Clara a widow at 36, though she would spend the next 40 years preserving and performing his work. The tragedy of Schumann is that his illness was inseparable from his art. The question remains whether the beauty he created was worth the price he paid. Vincent van Gogh. He created some of the most recognizable and valuable paintings in human history, yet during his lifetime he sold only one. Vincent van Gogh's artistic vision was inseparable from his tortured mind. From his early 20s, Vincent exhibited erratic behavior that worried his family. He would become obsessively fixated on ideas, whether religious fervor or romantic infatuation, pursuing them with frightening intensity. His letters to his brother Theo reveal a man constantly battling inner demons. In 1888, Van Gogh moved to Arles in southern France, hoping the sunlight would heal his mind. Instead, the isolation accelerated his decline. He invited fellow artist Paul Gauguin to join him, but their cohabitation was volatile. On December 23, 1888, after a heated argument, Van Gogh experienced a complete psychotic break. The exact sequence of events remains disputed, but what is certain is that Van Gogh took a razor and severed a portion of his left ear. He wrapped the bloody flesh in newspaper, walked to a local brothel, and handed it to a woman there, asking her to keep this object carefully. He then returned home and collapsed. When police found him the next morning, he was unconscious in a pool of blood. This was not his last episode. Over the next 2 years, Van Gogh was hospitalized repeatedly in psychiatric facilities. He experienced hallucinations, heard voices, and suffered seizures. During lucid periods, he painted with manic intensity, creating masterpieces like The Starry Night while institutionalized. He tried to poison himself by eating his oil paints and drinking turpentine. On July 27, 1890, Vincent walked into a wheat field near Auvers-sur-Oise and shot himself in the chest with a revolver. He managed to walk back to his lodging, where he died 2 days later in Theo's arms. He was 37 years old. Modern psychiatrists have debated his diagnosis for decades. The leading theories include bipolar disorder, temporal lobe epilepsy, and acute intermittent porphyria. What's undeniable is that his mental illness informed his art. The swirling, turbulent skies and intense colors that make his work so distinctive may have been how he actually perceived the world during manic episodes. Van Gogh's tragedy is that he saw beauty where others saw only chaos, but that same vision made ordinary life unbearable. John Nash. He was a mathematical genius whose work in game theory would win him the Nobel Prize and revolutionize economics, evolutionary biology, and computer science. John Nash's mind could see patterns and solutions that eluded everyone else. At age 30, while teaching at MIT, Nash was at the pinnacle of his career. Then, in 1959, his reality began to fracture. He started seeing patterns everywhere, coded messages hidden in newspaper articles and television broadcasts. He believed he was receiving communications from extraterrestrials and government agencies. He became convinced he was being recruited for secret missions. His colleagues at MIT noticed him writing incomprehensible equations on blackboards, and muttering about being persecuted. His wife, Alicia, watched helplessly as the man she married disappeared into paranoid delusions. Nash resigned from MIT and attempted to flee to Europe, trying to renounce his American citizenship, claiming he was a refugee. He was detained and forcibly committed to McLean Hospital outside Boston. Over the next 9 years, Nash was hospitalized multiple times. He underwent insulin shock therapy, a brutal treatment that induced comas. The voices in his head told him he was the Emperor of Antarctica, the left foot of God, and the Prince of Peace. He would wander the Princeton campus, writing cryptic mathematical formulas on blackboards and walls, becoming known as the Phantom of Fine Hall. His academic career was destroyed. His marriage collapsed under the strain, though Alicia never stopped caring for him. By the late 1960s, Nash was considered a cautionary tale, a genius burned out and lost to schizophrenia. But then, something extraordinary happened. In the 1970s, Nash's delusions began to fade. Not through medication or therapy, but through what he described as consciously deciding to reject the irrational thoughts. He taught himself to recognize when his mind was lying to him. By the 1990s, he had largely recovered, returning to mathematical work. In 1994, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. His story, dramatized in the film A Beautiful Mind, showed that schizophrenia doesn't have to be a life sentence. Nash worked and taught until 2015, when he and Alicia died together in a car accident. He was 86 years old, having reclaimed 3 decades of productive life from his illness. His recovery remains one of the most remarkable in psychiatric history, proving that even minds shattered by schizophrenia can find their way back to coherence. Sylvia Plath. She was a prodigy, a poet whose work crackled with raw emotional power and stunning imagery. Sylvia Plath seemed to have everything: literary genius, a prestigious education at Smith College in Cambridge, marriage to the celebrated poet Ted Hughes, and 2 children. Beneath this accomplished exterior, she was suffocating. Plath's first suicide attempt came in 1953 at age 20, during a summer internship at Mademoiselle magazine in New York. She returned home, stole her mother's sleeping pills, crawled into the space beneath the house, and swallowed them. She was found 3 days later, barely alive. After electroshock therapy and months in a psychiatric hospital, she seemed to recover. She channeled the experience into her semi-autobiographical novel, The Bell Jar, describing depression as being trapped under glass, able to see the world, but separated from it by an impenetrable barrier. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Plath maintained a facade of normalcy, while her internal world grew darker. She kept meticulous journals documenting her despair. She described feeling dead inside, going through the motions of life like an automaton. Her marriage to Hughes became turbulent. In 1962, she discovered he was having an affair. The betrayal triggered a catastrophic downward spiral. She separated from Hughes and moved with her children to a London flat. The winter of 1962 to 63 was one of the coldest on record in England. Plath lived in an unheated apartment, caring for 2 small children while battling severe depression. Her doctor had prescribed antidepressants and was arranging hospitalization, but the appointment was scheduled for later that week. On the morning of February 11th, 1963, Plath carefully sealed the rooms where her children slept with tape and towels. She left bread and milk by their beds. Then she put her head in the gas oven and turned on the gas. She was 30 years old. Her death came just months before. The Bell Jar was published under a pseudonym. The posthumous publication of her poems, collected by Hughes, would establish her as one of the 20th century's greatest poets. The cruel irony is that she died on the verge of the recognition she had desperately craved. Modern understanding suggests she suffered from severe depression with possible bipolar elements. Had she lived another decade, the medications that could have saved her would have become available. Her breakdown and death remain a symbol of how mental illness can extinguish even the brightest creative flames. Brian Wilson. He was the creative force behind the Beach Boys, a musical visionary who heard symphonies in his head and translated them into groundbreaking pop music. Brian Wilson's bass ear was damaged in childhood, forcing his brain to compensate by developing an extraordinary sensitivity to harmony and arrangement. This gift became a curse. In the mid-1960s, while his bandmates toured, Wilson stayed in the studio, crafting increasingly complex productions. He was pursuing a sound that existed only in his mind, layering instruments and vocals into unprecedented configurations. The result was Pet Sounds in 1966, an album that revolutionized pop music. But the effort broke something inside him. Wilson began using LSD and other drugs heavily, not recreationally, but as tools to access different mental states. He started hearing voices distinct from the music. During the recording sessions for the follow-up album Smile, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He installed a sandbox in his living room and conducted business meetings from it, claiming the sand under his feet connected him to childhood creativity. He heard voices criticizing his work, telling him the music was evil. One night, convinced that the song Fire had caused actual fires to break out across Los Angeles, he destroyed the master tapes. By 1967, Wilson had retreated to his bed, where he would remain on and off for the next decade. He gained massive amounts of weight, reaching over 300 pounds. He described lying in bed, hearing an entire choir singing criticisms of him in perfect harmony. His father's abuse, the pressure of maintaining the band's success, and possibly underlying schizophrenia had converged into complete collapse. In the 1970s and 80s, Wilson fell under the control of therapist Eugene Landy, who essentially imprisoned him through over-medication and psychological manipulation. Landy had Wilson on dozens of psychiatric drugs simultaneously, keeping him in a compliant stupor. It took a family intervention and legal action in the 1990s to free Wilson from Landy's control. Gradually, with proper treatment, Wilson began to recover. He completed and released Smile in 2004, nearly 40 years after abandoning it. Now in his 80s, Wilson continues to perform, though he admits he still hears voices. He's learned to function with them, distinguishing the real from the unreal. His story demonstrates that auditory hallucinations don't always mean complete incapacity. Sometimes genius and madness occupy the same neural pathways, and learning to navigate between them is the only path forward. Diana, Princess of Wales. She was supposed to be a fairy tale come true, a beautiful young woman who married the heir to the British throne in a ceremony watched by 750 million people worldwide. Diana Spencer became Princess of Wales at age 20, instantly becoming the most photographed woman in the world. The reality behind the fairy tale was a nightmare. Within the royal family, Diana was isolated, trapped in a loveless marriage to a man still in love with another woman. The pressure was unimaginable. Every outfit, every gesture, every expression was analyzed by global media. There was no privacy, no escape, no support system. Diana's mental breakdown wasn't a single dramatic event, but a gradual public disintegration. She developed bulimia nervosa, binging and purging multiple times daily. The eating disorder was her way of exerting control over a life where she controlled nothing. She would vomit so frequently that her electrolyte levels became dangerously imbalanced. She made multiple suicide attempts, most of them described as cries for help that went unanswered. She threw herself downstairs while pregnant. She cut her arms and legs with razor blades and a lemon slicer. She drove her car into a brick wall. Each time, the royal family's response was to hide the incidents and insist she appear perfect in public. In 1995, Diana gave an explosive television interview to BBC's Panorama, watched by 23 million people in Britain alone. She publicly discussed her bulimia, her self-harm, and her husband's affair with Camilla Parker Bowles. She said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." The interview was an act of spectacular defiance and a mental breakdown broadcast to the world. The royal family was horrified. The public was divided. Diana had broken the ultimate rule. she had revealed the dysfunction behind the crown. After her divorce in 1996, Diana seemed to be rebuilding her life. She was pursuing humanitarian work and finding happiness with Dodi Fayed. Then, on August 31st, 1997, while fleeing paparazzi through a Paris tunnel, the car she was in crashed at high speed. Diana died from her injuries at age 36. The outpouring of public grief was unprecedented, with millions recognizing in her a woman who had been destroyed by systems that valued image over humanity. Her death forced conversations about mental health, eating disorders, and the treatment of women in public life. Diana's breakdown was different from others on this list because it happened in the most public arena imaginable, witnessed by billions. She couldn't retreat to obscurity or hide in asylums. She had to endure her psychological torture under constant surveillance, and that surveillance ultimately contributed to her death. Her story shows that privilege and public adoration offer no protection when the mind begins to collapse, and sometimes the pressure of being watched can be what causes the breaking. These 10 stories carved into the historical record remind us that mental illness recognizes no boundaries of genius, wealth, or power. From kings to poets, composers to physicists, each mind collapsed in its own unique pattern, yet all shared the common tragedy of suffering in eras with limited understanding and treatment. What makes these breakdowns particularly significant is not just the individual suffering, but what they revealed about the human condition. They showed us that brilliance and madness often share the same neural pathways, that creativity can carry a devastating cost, and that the mind's ability to fracture is as profound as its capacity for genius. Modern psychiatry has given us tools that might have saved many of these individuals. Medications, therapy, and understanding that didn't exist have transformed outcomes, yet we still have far to go. If you found this exploration valuable, please consider giving it a like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most compelling stories. Thank you for watching.